discussed on this podcast are determined by the Justice Coordinating Commission of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Guest opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Sisters of Providence. To learn more, go to www.spsmw.org.
Welcome to Just Us, the podcast sponsored by the Sisters of Providence. We're talking about creating an equitable human community and influencing change. Through shared stories, conversation, and inspiration, you will learn how you can make a difference in your community. I'm your host, Jane Fisher, a Providence associate. In today's episode, I would like to introduce our guests, Patrice Payne and Tim Nation, who are joining us in this shared space to discuss systemic racism. Patrice, would you take a moment and introduce yourself, your background in education, and how you became to be an activist?
Hi, well, thank you, Sister, for this opportunity. As you mentioned, I'm Patrice Payne. I am a retired special ed teacher, started with the public schools and ended up at our parish school, St. Thomas Aquinas, which I retired from after 30 some years. And I have always been interested in racial equity. I'm mixed race myself, and so I'm always looking for opportunities for my family and for others to learn and to be given equitable treatment. And so just decided after retirement, I wanted to get more involved in that regard and became a member of the Race and Culture Committee at St. Thomas.
I see. And Tim, you've been in this field for how many years? Tell us about your background and the Peace Learning Center.
Yes, I helped get the Peace Learning Center started 26 years ago with a goal to help young people and adults learn conflict resolution skills. And, you know, doing that work, you realize when you're working to build peacemakers, if you don't focus on racism, then you're missing the mark, because you can help young people learn how to deal with their conflicts. But if larger systems are unjust, then a lot of the work is done for naught. So I've really had awakening that we need to work on racism. And so I've been doing this work for many years. Before that, I was the state AmeriCorps director when AmeriCorps first started, and have been involved in service and trying to change the world ever since.
And a few more people today with it. Thank you. Thank you both. Well, with all of our listeners, I am motivated by your experiences and insights, both of you, and help us learn to take action for the common good, because as they say, if not now, tell me when. This whole discussion around the term systemic racism or institutional racism, I'm going to ask you for some examples of it, but when I started reading the term systemic racism, the word systemic to me meant, oh, like something within a plant, something that comes up from the roots and gets spread throughout the plant. And it was a natural process that just began and grew. And how does the term systemic apply to racism, or the word institutional apply to racism? Tim, do you want to start with that?
I think it's first important to use an analogy the Racial Equity Institute uses. When you go to a pond and you see a dead fish, you think, man, that fish must be sick and must have been sick, and that must have been why they died. And then you start noticing many fish are dead, and you realize that it's not the fish that are the problem, it's the water, and that maybe it's even the groundwater. And what we've learned is that racism is so pervasive that it's like the groundwater, and we don't even notice it. We see its outcomes. We see people getting arrested and dying and inequities in our society. But we think about individuals rather than systems themselves. And so one of the best definitions of systemic racism that I've heard is that it's when a group of people are systematically denied power and resources based on their race. And so if you think about how are people denied power and resources because of the color of their skin, that's at the heart of systemic racism.
And Patrice, in your experience, when did you first begin to experience or notice that?
Well, it's a journey. You notice little things when you're growing up, and then you start to think about them and rationale and try to understand. I remember growing up in my household, the newspaper came out and said that poor whites are poorer than poor blacks. And she said, well, that's totally untrue. And some of the statistics currently is for every dollar that a white person has, a black person has 14 cents. So that was not true then, and it's not true now. In terms of systemic, it's as Tim said, it's part of the groundwater. It just affects all the systems that we need in our world to navigate life. For instance, the banking practices that have been in place, such as redlining and inequitable predatory lending that a lot of places operate on. Education, there's the preschool to prison pipeline. So looking at that is key to making sure that people are treated equitably. You look at statistics, Black folks often are suspended, expelled in special ed more often than others, and any people of color, really, not just Blacks. Healthcare is inequitable. In current day, there's some states where the legislators are not wanting to expand Medicaid under Obamacare, and consequently, many of the rural hospitals are closing or services are limited and people have to travel farther. And anybody, not just African Americans, but everybody has to travel farther for healthcare. Racism affects everyone, and there are many publications and reports and research that says billions of dollars could be back in our economy if it wasn't for racism, which would help everyone. So we all suffer because of racism and systemic racism.
And it goes way, way back, not just, well, the systemic part of the institutionalization of it within our government even goes farther back than many of us ever began to realize. I was born in a white community. So when I started learning about racism, it was all from a book. And the historians get to write their side of the story, right? Do you think, for example, that in our policies today, educational, voting, health, that we're moving forward at all?
Well, that's a great question, because I think that it's the history of America that we're taking a look at. Because really, when the Declaration of Independence was written, it talked about all men being created equal, and it really meant just white men. And then we also know that original Constitution had slaves in as 3/5 of a person. So, I mean, it was written into some of our founding documents. And of course, you know, slavery, a lot of people talk about has our original sin, but we cannot forget what happened to the indigenous people in our country too. I think we have two original sins, and it's how we took land from the indigenous people and created chattel slavery, which was a different kind of slavery than the world had ever had. The idea that once you were in America, you would be a slave for life and your children would be slaves, and generation after generation would be slaves. That was unheard of in the history of the world. So, because you could work your way out of slavery before that. One of the things historically that happened was with especially the Scotch Irish immigrants and some of the other immigrants who came over from Europe were indentured servants, along with Black people who were slaves from Africa. And why were these people imported to America? Because of tobacco. Tobacco is a very toxic crop that you need a lot of land for, but it's also very labor intensive too. So early on in America's foundations, the tobacco demand was so high that the plantation owners needed a lot of people to work. Well, at the beginning, the Europeans and the Africans worked together, and they worked against their slave masters, and they tried to demand rights, and they tried to there were a couple rebellions that happened in the 1600s in Virginia, where people who were running the plantations realized they needed to have the slaves, or the Africans and the Europeans, they needed to break their solidarity, and they needed to justify that. So a lot of the information and laws that were passed early on named white people as superior and Black people as inferior, and the laws were written to promote slavery and to drive a wedge between Black and white people. And in so many ways, even though slavery is gone, some of those original laws and ways of our culture still exist. And it's up to us to recognize those and work to change those. And just like Patrice said, if the average Black family only has 14 cents of wealth compared to the average white family, then something is way out of balance. And so yeah, those we talk about, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of the 1619 Project. And so, that was over 400 years ago when the first boat came with slaves. And that really set America in this dynamic that we still are living through with a Black and white country. However, ever since the Declaration of Independence and through our history, we have an amazing history of the people who were left out of those original documents working hard to claim their rights to be Americans and claim their rights to be able to vote and get equal citizenship. And that is what is beautiful about our country. And that's what all the rest of the world looks at us, how has we've been able to expand rights and responsibilities to as many Americans as possible. Now, that's always under attack, and sometimes we go backwards. But I think, just like Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice bends, the arc of the universe bends towards justice.
That's a good one. Patrice, you're nodding.
Yes, I totally agree. Another thing that I thought about in terms of democracy is, for instance, voting rights. It's under attack. Politicians continue to move lines and redistrict, and usually it's so that they can win the election, and they're just playing with numbers at our expense, at people's expense. There was an author who said, why can't we as a country, as a people, have nice things? And she didn't mean Mercedes and mansions. She meant affordable housing, enough money to put food on the table and not have to decide if it's get your prescription or buy the food. Can we have affordable daycare so more people can enter the workforce and not have to worry about their children? Can we have affordable insurance, medical insurance? So those are nice things that we as Americans should be entitled to, and we look to our government to help us have those. And many times they forget, I think, who they are really serving, and it becomes more of a self-interest. And we all suffer, not just African Americans and people of color, but the whole society suffers because of it.
I think you're right. And I think as citizens, many of us believe that we're trying to do the right thing. And then when the policies get promoted, they fail or they get changed. For example, if we live in communities where we have a lot in common with people, for example, you may have a well-integrated community, but you may not have. So if you live in a segregated community, your experiences are limited and you don't know, you're not aware of the inequalities that are there.
And research has shown that multicultural communities are the best problem solvers and figure out how to do things in a grassroots area. So by keeping us separate, we're not tapping into the creative talent and knowledge that all the people have, which would help everyone.
So in your career in education, what have you seen in terms of inclusion or work done to try and bring peoples together?
Well, we were fortunate, I believe, at St. Thomas because we consciously tried to work toward race relations, tried to make sure that we are aware of our own biases. For instance, we would always celebrate Black History Month, and we would have speakers come in, and they were often impressed by the knowledge, Black history knowledge of our students, both Black and white. And we've had other folks there as well. And so I think that was a testimony and tribute to the fact that we tried to educate ourselves, tried to be aware of our own biases and prejudices, because we all have them. And it's a journey, a life journey, not just a week or day or month. It's a lifetime journey to explore that. And also looking at your own past, your family's history, and where it connects in terms of the racial journey. People need to be aware, and if it's something that's not desirable, face up to it and move forward. How can you make amends for things that were done in the past? So in your family's genealogy. So I think it was a conscious effort and not always successful. The racial journey is fraught, it's emotional, and it's fraught with potential issues that people will get offended, and then other people are offended because they're offended. So you just have to make sure you have things in place to dialogue. We've got at our school now a safe place committee where families who have experienced something that they've been offended by have someone that they can talk to actually help them through the process. So dialogue and conversation, open-mindedness, and a willing to learn and grow are very important.
Mm-hmm. Not being afraid to ask questions.
Right.
And not being afraid to respond.
And not being afraid to be corrected when you're wrong or need to expand your worldview, and not take it be so sensitive to it that you can't grow.
Right. And at the Peace Learning Center, Tim, what are they focusing on there? I recently attended your implicit bias training, which was a real eye-opener for me. I didn't realize how early in life we can acquire biases. Would you like to speak to that?
Well, sure. We all have biases, and biases are natural. We prefer one thing to another. Where they come in problems is when we have biases based on race or cultural background, and we don't even realize it. And one of the things that we do with the implicit biases, we ask people to take the Harvard implicit bias test. Anybody can do this by just getting online and typing in Harvard implicit bias test. And they have a bunch of tests based on race and disability and gender and all sorts of things that you can see what your own biases are. And how do they do that? Well, they have a series of photos and words. And so they'll for the racial one, they'll have like a white faces and positive words, or black faces and negative words. And then they switch, and then it forces you to for those things that you're really comfortable with and where your biases are really go really quick. But those things that you have micro hesitations about, actually, that show your biases, that's where they show where you favor one thing over another. And so that's eye-opening in itself. But our workshops really try to get people to explore some of their own biases and their own backgrounds. And we do an activity called perceptions based on partial knowledge, where we'll have a person A, B, and C on a board, their characteristics. And we ask people to, just throw out their stereotypes and what they think of person A or person B or person C, just by the descriptors. And it's amazing what types of things people do when they just see a few words and some of the biases that come out. And then the facilitator will ask, well, could these three people actually be one person? And could this one person be in the room? And it turns out to be the facilitator themselves, because the person A, B, and C are just different characteristics to one person. But it shows how we'll just get limited information and we think that we know, but we really don't know. We really have to get to know people and know their backgrounds. And so it brings up those biases, but it also helps us realize what we do in different situations. Like some people will say, oh, that's a bad neighborhood. And what do they really mean by that? Do they mean that our Black people live there? There are these kind of subtle things that we do. But overall, at Peace Learning Center, our education focuses on three main components. Equity is one, where we do focus on implicit bias, and we also focus on microaggressions, that sometimes things that we do to other people by the questions that we ask or our reactions are actually aggressive, and we don't even recognize them. So we need to learn about microaggressions and those other kind of equity issues. But another component we focus on is social and emotional learning, to learn how to regulate our emotions and learn how to deal with conflicts and differences, because change and conflict are the constants in our lives. And we need to learn how to, for example, with teachers a lot of times have reflective anger. Their students have anger that they give out, and the teachers reflect the anger back to the students. And we have to learn how to teachers to be bigger than that, and to detach from the situation and learn how to calm down and approach things calmly. So social emotional learning is another. And last but not least, we also work on restorative justice. Restorative justice and restorative practices are ways teachers and schools and institutions can change the way they do discipline. Too much of our discipline in our society is punitive, and punitive doesn't work. When you spank a child or take things away from them or throw them in jail, we have all the results. The results are in. Guess what? It doesn't work. What do? You have to turn misbehavior and problems people are having into teachable moments. And so for restorative justice, instead of a student gets suspended for doing something like getting in an argument with the teacher, they have to sit in a restorative justice circle with that teacher, talk about the situation, how the teacher felt about the situation, and the harm that it caused. And then they have to come up with an action plan to address the harm and deal with the problems. And so we use this in lieu of suspensions and expulsions. For example, we had a high school student that took a fire extinguisher and blew it out into a cafeteria and made a big mess. The high school was thinking about expelling this student. So we had a restorative justice conference where the student and the parent and the student's mother and the janitor that had to clean up the mess and the administrator and us were in a restorative circle. And the janitor had to talk about what it meant and, to clean it up and the kind of problems that he faces. And the student had to listen to that. But then the janitor said, listen, I was like you when I was in high school, and I didn't do the right things, and now I'm a janitor and I didn't graduate. I want you to learn from this situation. And what happened was the student and the janitor decided that the student would help the janitor clean the lunchroom every day for the rest of the semester. After the student was done eating, then they would work with the janitor. And they did that the rest of the semester. They didn't get expelled, and they turned their life around. And so
Yeah.
that was a teachable moment. And that's what we need to do instead of throwing the kids out for 2 or 3 days without addressing the problem and expecting something to be different.
It's all education at one level or another, isn't it?
It
How we
really
carry
is.
it out and teach. Yes. And help me with this one. How would one of the things that I encounter and others hear when our discussions go into, here was a difficult moment, we hear these reflections about whites being defensive, white privilege, white fragility. How do we respond? I was in a situation very recently, and one of the people at the table said, hey, I have friends who are Black. Some of my best friends are Black. That to me often is a flag. And then I'll say, well, describe some of those relationships. Because I think sometimes that's a flag that's defensive. Do you
Yes.
have a reaction to that?
Well, first of all, so much white fragility is about wanting to feel comfortable all the time. And when we feel uncomfortable, when we learn facts of racism, how we, our fragility around that and our inability to even see that it's a problem. I really think that so much of the misunderstanding comes around this idea that white people feeling, first of all, that racism is only individual and they don't understand institutional and systemic racism like we talked about. So they think, oh, if I'm not in the Ku Klux Klan, then therefore I'm not racist. There's one thing about being not racist, and there's a whole nother thing about being anti-racism. Anti-racism is fighting against racism and recognizing it exists and doing something about it. Just thinking that you're non-racist and you don't have to do anything about it is why sometimes people say silence is violence. Because when you don't recognize it and you don't think it's a problem, then it's never going to change. And so it's really important for people to recognize that, and recognize the inequities. And I'm telling you, we've done such a great job as of white society of not even paying attention to it, but it has so many negative consequences, like we've talked about, that sometimes when you bring it up, and we do this at workshops, we say, why do people not like to talk about racism? Well, most white people say they've never talked about racism and they've never considered it. And it might as well be like talking about physics or something that people haven't studied. But yet it's real for people of color and they have to deal with it every day. And so it's that chasm that we have to bridge.
And ditto on everything Tim said, I would like to refer our listeners to a list that was put out by a professor in 1989, Peggy McIntosh. So this is really not a new term. It's just been one that's been brought to light and kind of weaponized. But she had an analogy. She called it the unpacking the invisible knapsack. She says white privilege is like having, all the special provisions, maps and charts and compasses that you need to navigate life. And it's unearned advantages that come just from being white in America. But most white people, the majority, do not have to worry about driving while Black. And if they are pulled over, the fear that are they going to die by the hands of the police. It's hard to go into churches and not see images of yourself or people of color in the congregation. So that puts a whole different spin on thing where you're always in the minority and always an outsider. If you've not been followed in a department store because of the color of your skin, just because you're just assumed that you're going to steal something, you don't have that on you. how many white parents have to have a talk with their teenagers when they start to drive, and giving them all the how to act with if they are pulled over, and what to do, and just to be fear, have to put that fear into them early on how to respond if they are pulled over by the police. So there are many things that white people don't have to navigate. There's a great book called White Catholics Guide to Racism and Privilege by Father Dan Horan. And he uses an analogy. If we're all driving down a road that's snowy, it's going to be difficult to navigate, but we're careful and we manage. But if we go through a road that's not been plowed, and we have snowbanks and drifts and things, then it's just almost impossible to pass through. And that's how he likens white privilege to on a snowy road, driving carefully, or snowbank that hasn't been plowed and having to navigate how to get through it. So I think it's a great visual and a great analogy to be able to put that in context.
Yes, I just want to add too that we decided 30 or 40 years ago to be a data-driven society, and we racially aggregated the data. So the data's in, and what we found out is it's terrible. That first of all, Black people are 2 to 8 times more likely to be arrested, to be kicked out of school, to lose their house, to lose their children to CPS, to have bad health outcomes. So much of it is our institutions. The outcomes with our institutions are terrible, and so the very institutions that are supposed to help these situations actually hurt so many people. And when it comes down to it, in our society and in humanity, there are only 2 relationships. There's the relationship of superior and inferior, and there's the relationship of equality. So superior, inferior, like with mother, son, parent, child, boss, worker, that of equality, co-worker, brother, sister. And equality is supposed to be all Americans. We're all supposed to be equal, right? Well, the problem comes in when some people think they're superior to others and the other person thinks that they're equal. And so you can think of that as an analogy with our society. A lot of people don't realize that they may think that they are superior to other people in different races or people from different backgrounds. But that's what the beauty of this country is supposed to be about. We're all supposed to be equal. Now, what about the road of equality for Black people? First of all, we talked about slavery started in 1619, and really it went on. Okay, so let's say it ended at the end of the Civil War, and then there was Reconstruction, right? Well, and the federal government stepped up and tried to help in some ways the Southern slaves, to get their own land, but a lot of promises about reparations and all that thing were never followed through on. But it wasn't 5 years later until Jim Crow laws started being put into effect, and reducing the ability of Black people to vote and own land, and even these ridiculous laws that if you didn't have a job, then you could be thrown in prison. And so a lot of the slavery still existed through sharecropping and those sorts of things. It continued after the Civil War, but then you get into the civil rights movement, and so if you want to say with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in 1965, 66, boy, it ended then. So let's say it ended then. Well, just think what Black people went through. They were left out of the New Deal, left out of their neighborhoods redlined, left out of business loans, farm loans, all the things that created the middle class. And so okay, now you're equal. Well, it's almost as if white people have been playing Monopoly for 400 years and then told Black people, now you can join our Monopoly game, but we own all the houses and apartments. And that's really the situation that we're in currently, that with the civil rights era, and here we are 50 years later. And there's been progress, but there's still a lot more progress to be made, and all those inequities from the past. I mean, throw out slavery, just all the things that happened in the 20th century that Black people were left out of. There's still, that's why there's so many disparities today.
Well, we're out of time, and I can't thank you enough, but you've both given us so much to think about and go over. So I had a whole list of things to talk about, a list
Well,
of
if it's only
terms.
20 minutes, me and Patrice could just talk for 10
Right.
minutes on one question.
Well, give us a wrap up. What should our listeners do? How can they take action to help things get better?
Well, I would suggest start off with prayer, because we're nothing without prayer, and do a deep dive into your own biases and your own experiences, and understand yourself and where you got your biases, and then educate yourself, keep an open mind, listen to people of color. A lot of people are poo-poo, oh, it's really not that bad, oh, but this, that, and the other, always making excuses. But deeply listen to people of color. Their experiences and their knowledge and their input will save us all, the guiding things that we need. There's some books that you can access that are excellent. When you have family gatherings at holidays and you have an uncle who's saying a racist comment, be bold. You don't have to attack the person, but you can attack or at least question in a kind way the whatever that is that's said that may indicate some racism simmering, and just kind of challenge the person on it. We are creating a Lenten calendar, for racial equity calendar for our parish, which will guide people with an activity each day to do in their racial journey. Part of that is journaling and researching and praying again, as I mentioned. There's a website called Embrace Race that's geared for parents and teachers of ages 0 to age 8, and it really targets getting racial harmony in little ones early on and letting them understand what different people are going through, and it's great resources. There's a book, as I mentioned, a couple others. One, the 272, which is the families who were enslaved and sold to build the American Catholic Church. And it talks about the beginnings of Georgetown University and how the Jesuits sold slaves, the slaves that were running their plantation and campus, how they sold them to keep it out of financial ruin. So just equating yourself and learning about history and knowing your own biases, and always pray would be the things I would suggest.
I think it's important to realize that to become an anti-racist is a journey. It's to walk down a path, and we don't know where the path leads because nobody's got to the end of it. And some people are further than others, but everybody needs to start down that path. And it takes awareness, it takes appreciation, and it also takes work and skills to deal with it. Really, what needs to happen is that we need to come together as Americans around making sure that everybody's needs are met. Why do we have homelessness? Why do we have poverty? We're the richest country in the world. We don't need those things. We can take care of those things in just in a snap. But for some reason we've decided that a few people making a heck of a lot of money is more important than everybody having a living wage. We really have to get real that solidarity is the way. 95% of us only have 5% of the resources. Think about that. 95% of us are all fighting against 5% of the resources, and people are at each other because we're worried that, oh well, white people are not going to be the majority in the future, and somehow that's going to hurt us economically. But we have to realize 5% of people have 95% of the resources. Why do we allow that to happen as a country and as a people? I'm not saying that we have to just go get rid of all of our billionaires and tax them, till they're not rich anymore. But my goodness, there are so many resources here. We all need to wake up that they need to be shared with everybody. And we need to build a society that we can be. We can be the great society that has been described to us in the past, and we've been taken off that track. But we have to come together as Americans to make sure that we can build that society that we all want to live in.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, just us listeners, for sharing this time and space with us today. We hope that you are inspired and have learned from our guests, Tim and Patrice. And I ask, are you now ready to make a difference with your own community? If not now, tell me when. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and will share it with others. Please leave your comments and reviews and any suggested topics. Talk with you soon.